the newsagents.
Is this government failing children, Minister?
That was Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, on her way into Cabinet, and not an F-bomb in sight. Her department have been trying to reassure this morning. They have put out an ad on social media saying most schools are unaffected by the concrete crisis.
Which is a bit like a supermarket saying most of our chicken will not give you food poisoning.
Or an airline saying most of our planes will land safely today.
Will not crash. You're kind of thinking about the ones that will rather than the majority that won't. I'm not sure it's as reassuring as they want it to be. In fact, Labour doesn't think it's reassuring at all, and they've been having a field day putting out their own version.
Yes, which says it's from the Mayor of Amity Island. And if you remember that from the film Jaws, it's called Jaws Update. Most beachgoers not eaten by big shark.
Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And it's Lewis.
And we are at Newsagents HQ. And of course, the fallout or the fall-in from concrete goes on and on and on, with ever new dimensions to the story and question marks even over whether Gillian Keegan can remain as Education Secretary. That's according to the Daily Telegraph, who thinks she is under severe pressure. I think the thing that still strikes me as the most extraordinary thing about this is, of course, it is about roofs. And the Tories proclaimed 10 years ago, almost exactly to the day, 10 years ago, that they were going to be fixing roofs. George Osborne, the Chancellor.
And of course, a very different story has been told in terms of how much fixing of roofs went on. Because we know that under Labour, there was a plan worth £55 billion starting in 2003 to refurbish every secondary school. But by 2010, when the Conservative government took over the coalition under David Cameron, that then changed. They scrapped the entire building scheme. They decided that repairs would be protected, but 700 school rebuilds would be stopped. And Michael Gove, who was Education Secretary at the time, thought it was a kind of pointless bureaucracy to be doing the Building for Schools programme. He said it wasn't getting there fast enough. And they essentially stopped it under the new government's austerity plan. And capital expenditure on education has fallen by a third since Labour held power. It's gone down from 8 billion in the last 3 years of Labour to 5 billion in these years of the Conservative government.
I think this is sort of part of a wider story, which it surprised me the extent to which, in recent years, it has been a relatively low importance political issue, or rather this issue has not got more attention, as to how much in terms of overall government spending education has declined. So when you've got something like health, for example, not only being protected year on year, but going up year on year, you can have an argument about whether it's enough, but, you know, it's gone up. Education, meanwhile, has basically been flatlined for years and years and years. If you go back to 2005, 1 in 5 of every pound the government spent on UK capital expenditure was in some way on schools. Now it's less than now it's around 1 in 20. And I think you can see this story to some extent as a vindication as to at least one of the strongest arguments that was made against prolonged austerity and deep austerity at the time. You can have an argument about, you know, whether some cuts were always going to happen, but there was always a question back in 2010, 11, 12 as to the extent and the depth. And one of the arguments always made was, okay, you can cut capital expenditure now. It's the easiest thing to do. Whenever government departments or a government or the Treasury is looking to save money, they go for capital budgets straight away, because that's the thing you can stop straight away. You can't control or substantially reduce spending on all of the other things. But in terms of new buildings, repairs to buildings, all that sort of stuff, you can stop it very, very quickly. The problem is, and the argument always made was, okay, you're saving money now, but it's going to cost you way more money down the line. And that essentially is being vindicated as an argument, not only in this part of public policy and politics, but in lots of others now.
But you've also had the intervention from the head of the National Audit Office. Yesterday, we had a retired permanent secretary from the Department for Education saying Rishi Sunak cut the budget, halved it on how much was available to spend on school repairs. Now we've had the National Audit Office, the current head of the National Audit Office, say the government have a sticking plaster approach, has only spent when it's become an emergency, and therefore wasted hundreds of millions of pounds at the last minute, when if they'd had a proper buildings programme, this wouldn't have been necessary. Extraordinary intervention.
Yeah. And the extraordinary thing, I think, is that it doesn't just go back to the austerity years. It goes back to 2020, when the Department of Education itself, just 3 years ago, estimated that £5 billion would be needed to mitigate serious risks and maintain buildings. That was their own estimate. It's not somebody else telling you what you should be spending. It's the Department of Education saying this is what we should be spending. And the Treasury, after that assessment was made, only allocated around £3 billion, 40% below what the government knew it should be spending, what it was advised. So it's not like it's just, it is a decades-old problem, but it's also an incredibly recent problem of which they've been aware.
Yeah, and you add into that as well, it's not just capital spending. In terms of the overall budget, even for current spending per pupil, it's basically been flat, as I say, over the last 10 years. And during that time as well, to throw in a kind of equality of opportunity argument into all of this, during that time as well, the per pupil spend in, say, the independent sector has gone up and up and up. I think the gap now is almost 3 times as high as it was back in 2009, 2010. So this is, as I say, in a way, I'm surprised that this is, as an issue, has not had more salience in our political debate over the past few years. But my God, it is now.
Yeah.
Small boats.
Small boats, yeah. Small boats, Brexit and so on. But, we are talking, the government likes to talk about productivity, and it likes to talk about, growing the economy. There is no better way of growing your economy than making sure you have a skilled workforce in the years to come. If you neglect capital spending and you neglect current spending on education, then you know what you don't get? A workforce that can compete in the modern world.
I think there's also interesting aspects of this about the politics of what is happening within Whitehall, just down the road from where we're recording this, and also what's been happening at number 10. Amelis, I think you were kind of hearing about some fascinating conversations that took place with the outgoing Director of Communications.
Yeah, I know this was meant to be a very big week of reset. This was meant to be, we know, a big week of reset and a massive reshuffle. And that massive reshuffle never happened. It all got sort of thrown out by this week that's had them reeling. It's all become about concrete and rack hell, and a Secretary of State that went off on one. So I've been hearing a couple of interesting conversations that went on. And this is Rishi Sunak trying to work out, essentially, who's with him and who's against him, who's on board, who actually gets what's happening. This was meant to be a big sort of beginning of term reset for Rishi Sunak, and he was going to come in and do a big reshuffle and a big reset and plan the speeches for conference and all the rest of it. And I understand that his Chief of Staff, Liam Booth-Smith, called department spads into his office and said, right, I need to know which of you think that Rishi Sunak's going to win the election, who thinks that we can win. And of course, there was no spad in the room that said no. But privately, I was told most of the spads of other departments do not think he has a chance of winning. And last week we saw the departure of Amber de Botton, who was his Director of Comms, and something very little known about their relationship is that actually she went to see him when he was Chancellor and went in for an interview, and he came out and said, I can't possibly work with her.
Because she had been from a broadcasting background.
She had come from ITV, and there was the sense that this would be a great fit when he was Chancellor, and he said, no, I can't work with her, that doesn't work. She never got the job when he was Chancellor. But then, when he was Prime Minister and they were sort of desperate for a Director of Comms, she was the sort of best person available. She came in, and she wouldn't be the yes woman that Rishi Sunak needed. And he preferred to have people around him who were a bit more, prepared to buoy him up and agree and all the rest of it. And they just couldn't find what they call landing ground for them to work on. She felt undermined. He ignored her advice. She quit last week, and he's got people now very closely to him, one of whom, I'm told, is only on a 6-month contract. So is not actually staying for the election, unless the election happens in 2 months' time. But they are all thinking in terms of who's actually loyal right now to a man who might lose.
And so you basically go into what has now become a fully fledged crisis that is, really potentially deeply politically damaging, without number 10 having a head of communications. And I think that you are basically seeing some of the effects of that and some of the weakness around the centre from Number 10 exerting its power in Whitehall. I mean, I've been speaking, sort of continuing from what we were talking about yesterday, I've been speaking to people in different departments who are absolutely furious with the Department for Education right now. Someone put it to me, official put it to me, you cannot overestimate the extent of the anger in the Cabinet Office, Department for Levelling Up, the Department for Health, all these different departments and agencies which are being affected by this, because of course they have responsibility towards their own estates. And people are asking, well, what about the courts? What about the hospitals? The care homes, all of that sort of stuff. And there is a sense, now, and I have to say, Department for Education denied this to me strenuously. They'd say it's not the case. But there is a sense in Whitehall that the Department for Education and Gillian Keegan have not been acting in a collegiate way, that they have been freestyling, that they have been issuing communications and making policy that is not consensual. I mean, I'm looking at a piece of communication in front of me here from a different department. Someone sent to me saying, as you're aware, the Department for Education made the announcement without informing us, the Cabinet Office, or any of the other departments with estates that may be impacted by RAC. Now, that's part of an official... That is a bit of correspondence from a senior person in a different department. So that is just a little taste of the irritation in different departments. And as we were saying yesterday, I think that is part of the story of that clip with Keegan, because she was basically saying, I'm doing something about it, our department is doing something about it,
where are you
none of the other departments are, and we're getting the flak for
famously sitting on their asses.
Well, quite so.
But this takes you back to the end of the major years, where the centre is not really functioning, and you've got a Prime Minister who is ordering cabinet ministers of what to do, and they're all going their own way because they see an election coming which they're going to lose, and they are trying to secure their own position. And it ends up with Michael Portillo putting phone lines in so that he can launch his own leadership bid against John Major, John Redwood out on manoeuvres when he was the Welsh Secretary, etc., etc. And it's disintegration of the centre. And
the centre cannot hold.
The centre cannot hold, and that is a sign of political weakness.
But you know what? But in a way, Rishi Sunak missed a chance, didn't he? Because if this was meant to be the first week back at school, you do what Keir Starmer did yesterday. You do a big reshuffle and you show you mean business. And the person I was speaking to, very close to Rishi Sunak, said, why didn't he just take the bull by the horns? We know that there are people who need to be moved. You can't go into an election with Suella Braverman. You can't go into an election with Therese Coffey in those jobs. They even mentioned Jeremy Hunt, which surprised me. And I said, but, isn't he the safe pair of hands, the steadying ship and all the rest of it? And this person said, yeah, but they've done that. They need to go into the election with a creative chancellor. They need to have a Brown, an Osborne, somebody who actually offers the electorate something they can get excited about. And so he suggested there needs to be a proper bravery in terms of actually shuffling your people around to give you something that looks like a confident front bench.
Which is what Starmer has done.
But who is there that Rishi Sunak can suddenly say, I know, I'm going to put you in? And Jeremy Hunt is pretty much unsackable, and that's the problem that Gordon Brown faced in the run-up to 2010 when he wanted to move Alistair Darling from Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Alistair Darling said, I ain't going. And Alistair Darling won that arm wrestle.
Because I've seen you through a crisis. I've seen you through a crisis. You can't get rid of me now, which I think is what Jeremy Hunt could sort of legitimately say. But at some point, there has to be a vision from Sunak, right? All he's doing at the moment is putting out 100 fires in 100 places, not even putting them out, probably like throwing petrol on them half the time. But there isn't a vision that you can go, oh, that sounds exciting.
No, but instead of worrying about his Chancellor and his cabinet, which is a slightly longer term thing, as you say, Emily, he's got to get number 10 in order. And probably if they had a head of communications that the Prime Minister was trusting and was fully in control of, then you wouldn't have, to go back to what you were saying at the very top of the show, you wouldn't have, which again I suspect is a bit of freestyling here, the Department for Education and Gillian Keegan controlling some of the comms around this and ending up in the very unfortunate position of tweeting out a picture which says most kids are going to be fine.
Most kids will survive their ceilings.
Well, in a moment we're going to be talking to Craig Oliver, who was at number 10 Downing Street as Director of Comms during the Cameron years, for his take on how the government is handling or not handling this. Craig Oliver, it doesn't seem just to be the concrete that's crumbling, it's government messaging as well. What do you make of it?
Well, I used to brief MPs and cabinet ministers a lot of the time, and I do a sort of stump speech to them, which started with, journalists are not your friends. And then the second thing was anything you say outside of your office or your home is fair game. And I think Gillian Keegan really fell foul of that. Somebody of her experience and level should have known that if she said something like that with a microphone on her and a camera pointing at her, there was only one outcome from that. And I think it showed a kind of weird sort of entitlement. I think she thought that she could have this sort of chatty thing and people might sort of agree with what a tough time she'd had of it over the weekend. And it just played into the sort of out of touch, are you in control narrative that Labour are building up.
It had the ring to it of Tony Hayward. Do you remember after the BP oil spill, who said, I just want to get my life back? The one thing you're not allowed to do, it seems, in public office is think about yourself.
Yeah, and look, we live in a time where the expectations on any problem is that you are on it immediately. And I think if you're going to play at that level, if you're going to be a cabinet minister and something falls on your desk on a Friday afternoon, you have to react quickly. You have to demonstrate grip. You're not necessarily going to have all the answers immediately, but you have to go out there and say, look, I'm on it and I will not rest until I've sorted it, especially as you're entering into an election year and you're just coming off holidays. And the problem was it looked a bit complacent. It looked like it was a bit of an imposition that she was having to deal with it and her staff were having to, get off their backsides and do stuff.
We were reading between the lines, given what we'd also found out from the Department of Education, and looking at the fractures actually between cabinet members, between the government advisors, in terms of who thinks that she went too early on all this stuff. That she had gone out there, basically winged it a bit, and no one else was ready for that. And she was almost, in that clip, justifying having been the one that blew the whistle.
To a point, I think that the reality is as soon as you're aware of these things and there is genuine danger to people, you have to be able to react quickly. And if any inquiry or anything afterwards looked like you were being slow while children were coming back to school, I think more to the point is she's trying to point to we live in a quite complicated environment where 30 years ago contracts were signed, local authorities are responsible, civil servants didn't necessarily ring the alarm bell as quickly as they could. The problem with that approach, if you're a Secretary of State, is nobody cares. You're not going to ever be given any slack on that. The buck stops with you, and you have to demonstrate that you accept and understand that. And I think that was a real problem for her yesterday. It looked like dealing with a serious problem, dealing with a crisis, felt like an imposition rather than her duty as somebody who's elected.
There's been suggestions that other government departments didn't know that she was going to make that announcement on RAC and the school closures and all the rest of it. Do you think that's possible?
It is possible, and I think that there is a real issue with the sheer complexity of government. Internally in departments, often a lot of times people don't know what the left hand's doing, what the right hand's doing, that sort of thing. I find in this case, I suspect that is quite unlikely. It's possible that at the end of the summer, it's possible that people just went very quickly without informing others. But in reality, I don't really buy it. The reality is that the government machine has to be quick enough off the mark to be able to make announcements, to be able to say that information's coming out. I was looking at my social media feed in the last couple of hours, and messages that really should have been going out Friday or Saturday morning are starting to flow out now about how information's going to come out. It looked to me that they were actually more asleep at the wheel rather than actually ahead of everything.
Craig, can I take you to the, as it were, concrete issues at the bottom of all this, which is that Labour was spending money on a Building for Schools programme until 2010, when the government changed. And that was the government you worked for. It was David Cameron. It was Michael Gove, as Secretary of Education, who basically slashed the spending, who said, we need radical reform. We don't want to spend money on pointless bureaucracy. All this Building for Schools stuff is wrong. I mean, when you look back now and you see the decisions that were taken, by Osborne's austerity plans, by Gove saying end of Building for Schools. I mean, do you feel quite horrified that that's the legacy of that time?
I understand that people want to say that austerity went too far, and I get that they feel very strongly that certain things should have been spent on and others shouldn't, and that it should have all worked out. I think that what people are not working out and not dealing with is just how difficult our economic situation was then. And the feeling was that we needed to get the books in order. And if we didn't get the books in order, that it would be worse in the long run. You can't prove that argument, but I think that a lot of people who believe in sound money feel comfortable that actually some difficult decisions had to be made. Look, of course, schools need to be invested in, and of course, it needs to be done properly, and that we need to be in a situation where they're not falling down. I don't think anybody took that decision expecting that they were going to have aerated concrete and that this was going to be happening 10 years later.
But they knew these problems were, as it were, in the works of the schools, because that's why Labour was spending money on rebuilding them. I just mean there was something very cavalier, wasn't there, about Gove in education, talking about the blob, talking about bureaucracy, saying we need radical reform, throwing all the kind of messy stuff out the window, which has now literally come back to bite us and our children.
Well, Gove is a different story. And I think with respect, I think you're mixing a whole load of things together then in terms of taking on the establishment of education and how unpopular he became. What I do think is very interesting is that Michael Gove actually got moved from being Education Secretary, because what should have been a flagship policy for the Conservative Party and for the coalition government, free schools, was just not cutting through, and they were deeply unpopular. And that's what's really interesting about that point, is it was really cutting through at the school gate, and it was really cutting through in terms of the polling. So that's why he was moved. And that's why I think this issue is so toxic for the government at the moment. It's a real school gate issue. Yeah. I'm sure we all know people who are not really sure whether or not their kids are going to be in a classroom next week, if they're going to have to take time off work. And I think that's the reality of this situation, is when you have a problem, have you got a grip? The government's trying to show that it's got a grip, and it didn't.
Just one other thing on the grip element of this. The Department for Education has put out a big banner, bold poster kind of on social media and elsewhere this morning saying most schools are unaffected, which sort of kind of has, the Labour Party has put out a report saying most beachgoers not eaten by big shark. It's hardly reassuring.
Yeah, I mean, look, I saw that message and thought, look, you really need to sharpen that up. I mean, I think that what they probably needed to do was make clear that 90 odd, and I think it's the high 90% of people that will be unaffected by this. That's not very reassuring for the people who are affected, but it gives some sense of the proportion of the problem. It looked a bit slapdash, it looked a bit blasé, and I think that is the problem that they've got overall with this, is they didn't react quick enough. They looked like they didn't really have a grip on it. They looked pissed off when they were asked any difficult questions about it. And that really cuts through.
Yeah, so interesting. Craig, one other thing. You started the interview by talking about how Gillian Keegan should not have expected anything different from ITV other than that for that clip to air. I mean, your past was as an ITV political producer and then with us at the BBC. How easy or complex a decision do you think it was for ITV to say, actually, we're going to run it?
I think that one was pretty straightforward. She was still facing the camera and the mic was on. She would have had every expectation that it was running. And I think that actually what she did was expect people to feel some kind of sympathy for her, and thought that this kind of gambit would actually go down very well with people. In fact, it went down like a lead balloon. Much more complicated was actually the Gordon Brown one, where he called one of his constituents a bigot, or somebody who was trying to persuade to elect him a bigot, when he was in a car driving away from the interview and the microphone was still on him. I thought that was a much trickier one. But the reality is, if you are in politics, if you are near a camera, if you are near a microphone, you have to expect that whatever you say will get used. It may not be fair, it may not be right, but it pretty much will get used.
Just talk us through, Craig. Would you have run that if you'd been at the BBC?
Well, I think I may be wrong here, but let's check it. But I'm pretty sure that the Gordon Brown one was a BBC thing, wasn't it?
No, it was a Sky radio mic. But the BBC played it to Gordon Brown on the Jeremy Vine show.
Yeah.
God, there's so much sad knowledge in our heads. It's pathetic.
You can never get rid of it. But I'm just curious whether, would a national broadcast, would the BBC feel able to run that? And I guess the next question is, if it had been, as it were, an incoming government rather than something that feels like an end of days government, would that shift your perspective as an editor?
Look, I think the Gillian Keegan one yesterday was straightforward, and I don't think anybody in any editorial position would have cut her any slack on that on any channel. It was just, she said it was within seconds of the interview going, she knew she was on mic, she knew she was on camera. I don't think anybody would have had a problem with that. It becomes more nuanced and more difficult when you have somebody who doesn't think they are on mic or on camera and thinks they're in a private space, which is actually what happened to Gordon Brown. And the BBC did decide to run that, and I think they got quite a bit of criticism for it. But then you're into a real sort of like tricky one about, are you hiding stuff that people say about their constituents and electorate, that kind of thing. The bottom line of this is politicians who have to expect you say something like that with a microphone on, it's going to be reported.
Look, there, but for the grace of God. We all know what that feels like up to a point, don't we? So, yeah, Craig, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Brilliant to have you, Craig. Bye.
Thank you.
Welcome back. And last year, the Commonwealth Games were held in Birmingham, and it was hailed as the start of a golden decade for the city. Spool forward 1 year, not looking quite so golden, or if it was golden, the gold will have to go to a pawn shop, because Birmingham City Council has sort of gone bust. And here with us is Lewis, his home city.
We've broken it.
Is it because
You've broken it?
It's bust.
Nobody's buying spivvy suits in Birmingham City Centre anymore.
Right, this is, I tell you what, this is getting out of control.
Do you know, sorry, Emily, one other bit from the wedding, which hasn't been discussed
For
before,
God's sake, here we go.
is his best man revealing that elocution lessons might have de-Birminghamified someone's accent.
I tell you what, this is spin. This is a spin war. How dare you? This is unbelievable.
Just thought I'd mention
Anything
it.
else?
En passant.
Anything else?
I think we're going to get a bit of Brummie accent back in here. Right.
I don't know what you're talking about, Emily.
So just talk us through this then, because a council, it is Birmingham City Council going bust.
Yeah.
Which just, I mean, it's, you know, it sounds unreal, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it's not the first council to do so over the last year or so, and I suspect it won't be the last either. So this is...
But it is the biggest.
It is the biggest. So this is important for two reasons. First of all, in and of itself, this really matters. Birmingham City Council covers 1 million people. It is the biggest council in Europe, has by far the biggest budget, billions of pounds, of any local authority in Britain. So it matters in and of itself, but it also matters because of what it says about the state, the parlour state of local government in Britain, which of course is the bit of government that most people interact with most of the time. So Birmingham has issued this thing called a Section 114 notice. That is the equivalent of a council saying that it's insolvent, that it can no longer afford to pay for its bills. And it's not like a company, it's not like going bust as such, not like it's been liquidated. I suppose the closest equivalent is really a company calling in the receivers, where it continues to operate, but the management, and in this case obviously the Labour-controlled council, cannot take any new decisions. It does all of the things that it is obliged to do by law, i.e., continue to provide education services, continue to provide children's services, continue to provide old people's homes, but it cannot take any decisions, political decisions, anymore. It has no further discretion over policy until such time as it comes to an arrangement with the central government as to how it's going to fund itself going forward.
So I'm reading that one of the things that really pushed it over the edge was this £1 billion equal pay bill.
Yeah.
So this is what happened essentially, that they've called in external auditors, they've looked at the accounts for 2020 to 2022, and they do not fully account for equal pay liability and are therefore not closed. So what was that about? I mean, this is a gender thing, is it?
Yeah, so this relates to a Supreme Court decision back in 2012, which found that the council had not been paying its staff, its female staff, in the same way that it had been paying its male staff over the previous decades. So it related to wage settlements and bonuses. And this has essentially given the council a liability of, I was talking to one councillor on the council earlier, they were saying it's probably going to end up costing over £1 billion. £1 billion, which is basically all of its day-to-day spending budget for the year. So, and indeed, and then you couple that with...
So it basically, Lewis, was saving money by not paying its women properly.
Basically, over a long period of time, yeah. And that could affect other councils as well. But, that isn't the only reason. So you throw into the mix as well, there's been some mismanagement. There was an IT program which ended up costing 5 times as much as it should. Birmingham has a long history of difficulty. I mean, as I say, it's the biggest council. There have been lots of arguments over the years that maybe it should be broken up. It's too unwieldy. Its children's services have been shambolic in all sorts of ways. But then you throw into that, so you've got all that on the one side, and then you've got all the stuff that is affecting all councils, which is rising demand in the form of an ageing population, more demand on its children's services, more demand on its older people's services, all the things that councils up and down the country are dealing with. And over years and years and years, going back to our earlier conversation, smaller and smaller real-term budgets, or cuts, or meagre increases in recent years. So you throw all of that together, and you end up in a situation where the biggest local authority in Britain is now bankrupt.
And also, going back to where we started, which is schools, I learnt something that completely horrified me today, which is that the government is not responsible for the safety of buildings. Technically, it is devolved to local authority and to academy trusts. So you imagine, getting whacked with a school's safety bill now as a local authority. Yeah. I mean, Birmingham's not going to be the last. That's what I'm saying.
No, indeed so. And the government have not been clear, just on the building stuff, as to whether this is going to be paid for with new money or with existing capital money. But ultimately, as we said yesterday, the government sets the budget, so that has all sorts of effects. But this is going to have a political effect as well, which is, I guarantee you, and in fact, Greg Hands, the Tory chairman, has already tweeted this today, the words you were going to hear again and again and again leading up to the election are Labour-run bankrupt Birmingham. Again and again and again. But of course, and there are questions about the political management of the city, but there are, it's just worth bearing in mind, this is not something that only affects Labour councils. Conservative Northamptonshire Council issued a 114 last year for exactly the same reasons. And as someone put it to me earlier today, this won't be the last. No way will this be the last. There are loads of councils just teetering on the edge.
But Birmingham hasn't always been Labour run, to be fair. It's been a coalition, it's been Lib Dem at one stage, it's been...
Yeah. But it's not going to be like in the US, where a city goes bankrupt, it really can go bankrupt.
Do you remember Detroit?
Well, I went to moved to the US when Detroit was still bankrupt, and one of the first stories we were doing was whether the Detroit Art Gallery was going to have to flog its paintings to help pay the bills. And I went to Detroit, and there were whole streets where nobody lived there anymore.
You're going to have like a Lewis Goodall sort of childhood memorial museum or something.
Should raise about 65 quid a year.
Sell your suits.
Yeah, sell my suits, another 65 quid a year.
Maybe that's maybe overstated.
Things aren't that desperate. But
I do want him wearing something in the studio, to be honest.
You're going away, you're going to have to deal with this.
But do you think he'd get 65 quid for the suits? I'm not sure.
Tell you what, this has been a bad day for Birmingham in all sorts of ways. But in all seriousness, I mean, the net result of this is going to be, you're right, John, we don't declare, cities don't go bankrupt as such, but what it will happen, it happened in Croydon recently as well, is that what will happen is local residents will end up seeing their council tax hiked up substantially, and their council services will suffer. And as a result, you're dealing with, in Birmingham's case, some of the most deprived areas in the country. The people who lose out are those 1 million people. As I say, it will happen in lots of other places as well. And there is it relates partly to the tension between central and local government, which is that central government thinks these places are all being really badly managed, but we have to pick up the pieces at the end of it. And local government thinks, well, they're just not giving us enough money. And on and on and on the cycle goes.
We'll be back in a moment where the news agents will be the old agents.
The olds agents.
Another joke about my suits, maybe?
No, not enough. It's not all about you, Lewis.
Oh, right, okay, fine, yeah.
The valid votes given to each candidate was as follows. Rishi Sunak, 60,399. Liz Truss, 81,326. Therefore, I give notice that Liz Truss is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Will come up on stage.
Well, thank you, Sir Graham. It's an honour to be elected as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. I'd like to thank the 1922 committee, the party chairman, and the Conservative Party for organising one of the longest job interviews in history. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank my family, my friends, my political colleagues.
Oh, a year ago today.
Longest job interview in history for the shortest premiership in history.
I think she probably spent more time interviewing for that job than doing it, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. The campaign was longer than her premiership, substantially longer.
Yeah, and there was just one person in that whole list of thanks that she forgot to mention and say thank you to, which was Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, in the end, it was like every sports day you've ever been at, where all the kids win. You all get to be Prime Minister for a bit. But at that point, where she's making that acceptance speech, she's thinking, bloody hell, I've done it. I'm going to be the one that sees the Conservative Party through to the next election, that secures a victory and beyond, secures a bigger majority even than Boris Johnson. I mean, can you imagine if somebody had put that crystal ball in front of her and said, that podium, that's going to be back there in about a month's time.
We don't know.
What's he going to do? What do you mean? What am I saying at the podium? Is there a war or something terrible happen? No, you're going to be resigning. Well, I don't think so. Yep.
The thing is, I think Liz Truss is going to end up having more influence on the Conservative Party over the long term than Sunak is. Sunak is going to be, if all the polls are right and we just end up in the situation we think we do, where Labour win, Sunak will be gone, and I expect he will leave Parliament very, very quickly. Truss is going to stick around. Truss thinks, she and her team think that, they won, that they lost the battle, but they're going to win the war over the soul of the Conservative Party on economics and politics. That she is going to, and this is what's behind all her speeches that she's making. She'll stay in Parliament. She considers herself a martyr to the free market cause and free market economics and all the things that she believes in. And in a situation where the Conservative Party is a rump and leaderless and rudderless, she's not going to come back as leader. But she thinks, and I think she's probably right, that she can exert a pull over the political gravity.
Do you know
of the
what that
Conservative
misses,
Party.
though, Lewis? It misses the effect that she is still having on most people's cost of
they
living.
live in a different reality, Emily, don't they?
Even today. Yeah, but I'm just saying, funnily enough, my son, who's studying in Canada, went back yesterday, and he couldn't believe the difference in the interest rate, in 12 months, because she did something so extraordinary in that short space of time to our mortgages, to our cost of living, to our pensions. She destroyed so much and so little that is still having its effect on everyone trying to pay bills now.
That's so true. But as we know, the internal conversation of the Conservative Party has been so unmoored from reality for quite a long time. And they're going to become even more unmoored, as it were, from reality in an opposition period. So, I mean, she is already setting up, and she's talked about this in speeches, and she'll do it far more in the future. There is this, as we know, deeply conspiratorial bent now within Conservative thinking. It's all about the deep state. The deep state was taking us down, the economic establishment. She will continue to build on that in the years ahead. I'm sure a book will be forthcoming, and she will become, and she will get an audience for that within the Conservative Party, even certainly not within the wider country.
Lewis, you predicting that Liz Truss is going to continue to play a major role in politics and public life is possibly the best news I've heard for the news agents.
Liz, come back.
God bless her. We were a week old when she started. It was rock and roll.
She was the first person who used podcast as an insult.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a 7-letter
Living in our
word.
townhouses.
4, 5, 6, 7. It was a 7-letter dirty word, wasn't it?
We'll be back tomorrow. Well, I won't. You two are in charge now for the next
Oh
couple of
yes,
weeks.
you're our consul. You're heading to be temporary consul general in Australia, aren't you?
No, we've got a very fine High Commissioner doing an excellent job,
Yes,
and I
but
might be going to have lunch with her.
Oh, you amaze me. Well, we'll see you on Good Morning Australia for the next few weeks, I assume.
Maybe.
Strictly Come Ballroom, something.
Strictly Come Sopal.
We'll see you soon. Bye.
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 The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.